Buenas tardes. Un año más nos unimos al movimiento Fashion Revolution en esta semana que organizamos con la Casa encendida para conmemorar a las más de 1.200 personas que perdieron la vida en los derrumbamientos de Rana Plaza en Bangladesh. Este año hemos querido dedicar esta semana a la protesta, al activismo, a cómo como ciudadanas podemos denunciar que no queremos seguir alimentando esta rueda. Empezamos la jornada con esta entrevista a Sarah Corbett como fundadora de Craftivist Collective y lunes, martes y miércoles ofreceremos un taller desde la perspectiva del trapolar de craftivismo online y el jueves cerramos la sesión con un conversatorio donde nos plantearemos cuáles son los retos de la moda sostenible con dos organizaciones como son Campaña Ropa Limpia y Greenpeace y dos proyectos, Infinite Denim y Kavita Parmar, que podrán conversar sobre estos retos. Vamos a arrancar con la entrevista a Sarah Corbett. Sarah, welcome.
Thanks.
I will introduce you, just say that you are a professional activist, the creator, the hands, the heart of Craftivist Collective, writer of my little book of Craftivism and the Art of Gentle Protest. For me, reading the Art of Gentle Protest was kind of a way to frame the protest we were doing too, so it was really inspiring. So welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Sorry, I'm not letting you talk.
No,
Let's start framing what is Craftivism. So if you can make us a little historic frame of what this is.
Yeah, so Craftivism was a word coined in 2003 by an American lady called Betsy Greer. So if you Google craft and activism, that comes up in 2003. But if you look throughout history, I mean, lots of people watching this will know that craft has been used for decades and centuries that involves politics and activism. So from more recently with the suffragettes using their brand colours to make badges and make sashes and then you've got union banners to also places like in Chile where people would make apiliers, which are these beautiful small appliques, which were created under the Pinochet dictatorship to share the atrocities that were happening that weren't being shared in the public. And even Gandhi, you know, you could say that Gandhi was a craftivist in some ways with him using his spinning wheel, talking to, you know, wearing his one sheet, talking about how we need to use resources ethically and also sustainably. So it's always been there, but the word itself was coined in 2003. And I always say craftivism's a little bit like punk. If you think of punk music, you've got all of these different bands and musicians that sound very different, but they're all under that umbrella. And I see craftivism as similar. I do gentle protest craftivism, but there's lots of other forms of craftivism out there, from yarn bombing and knitting graffiti to some of the stuff that I do and everything in between.
Okay, so could you tell us what is Craftivist Collective?
Yeah, so I set up the Craftivist Collective in 2009. I started doing craftivism in 2008. I didn't know the word craftivism existed, but I noticed that handicraft really helped me think more critically and strategically and helped me be a better activist. And suddenly people around the world wanted to join in the projects I was doing. So I set up the collective in London in the British Museum Cafe with strangers and friends who wanted to meet up, but always knew from the beginning that this was something that people around the world wanted to join in. So I have projects for people to do. I have books and kits and tools, as you can see, and a manifesto and lots of free resources. And it's a collective in the loose sense of the word. So anyone that takes part in our projects and that uses gentleness as a form of craftivism is welcome into the collective, and we have people all over the world who share their own projects, getting involved in our projects, and share their craft thoughts, which is what they're thinking while they're stitching, as well as the progress and the object that they've made. So it's a global collective, and it's people all over the world sharing what they do on social media and online, and we meet in person as well.
Wow. We will go further in the collective, but as you say, that this gentleness, for me, gentle is a really interesting word. In Spanish, we don't use it that much, and it has real power. What moved you to go to this gentle protest?
Yeah, I mean, in England, it's quite a divisive word at the moment. So often people think of gentle as in passive or weak. For me, gentleness is all about compassion. It's about self-control. It's about being of service, being kind, being loving, and doing protest in this compassionate, loving, strategic way. Like I said, craftivism's lots of different forms of activism. And when I started doing craftivism in 2008, there wasn't much other people doing it. Now there's lots more craftivists, and you can, because I didn't coin the word craftivism, I can't say, well, it's only this. So what I found with my activism is, with my craftivism, is the more I was doing it, the more I noticed that it was this gentleness that was where the real power was. It was like the golden thread in my craftivism. So we'll talk about a bit later about how I use it as gifts for power holders and for street art. But it was about engaging people in a gentle way that intrigues them, that isn't demonizing them or isn't telling them what to do or naming or shaming them. It's not about treating people as robots or patronizing and oversimplifying. It's about this loving way to try and encourage and entice everyone to be part of the solution in their own way, using their own power that they can do. So you can do craftivism where you cross-stitch swear words and share them online. There's craftivism out there where people have crocheted voodoo dolls of world leaders, and it might get many more likes on Instagram than a lot of my stuff, but I find that quite harmful. I don't think it's effective, and if anything, I think it can be more harmful than helpful. So if you think of a voodoo doll of Donald Trump, for example, which was quite popular a few years ago, you'll get lots of people who don't like Donald Trump who'll like it and share it, but you're focusing on a personality rather than policies. You're focusing on saying that you're labeling that person rather than saying what change that they can be, what change that you can be. So it's much more polarizing and divisive than what we need, which is a more harmonious society that we can all be part of. So that's why I have quite clear boundaries in our manifesto of how to do craftivism in a gentle way, where you can control your anger and sadness and channel it into something effective that makes real change. And you do it in a way that isn't polarizing, that creates common causes where everyone feels they can be part of the solution rather than competing with others.
Yeah, later we are going to go deeper in the activities so we can understand better this.
Yeah.
But I had this question that is, if anybody could be a craftivist.
Oh yeah, I mean, I learned how to do handicraft online. So in school, we didn't have much sewing skills or lessons. I was much more interested in drawing and painting, but I couldn't do that while I was traveling as much. And I only really got into DIY crafts when I was working for a charity as a professional campaigner. So I learned a lot of my skills from YouTube and from friends and from a few books. So I always say, if I can do it, anyone can do it. And I think because of my background is in activism, so I grew up in a low-income area in Liverpool in the UK with lots of inequality. My dad is the local vicar, minister there. My mum is a local politician. So we were always involved in campaigns on a local level, on a global level. I saw campaigns win and lose. So I'm very much an activist at heart. And I think that's what makes me useful in the Craftivist Collective, because we focus on how can craft serve activism rather than shoehorning a love of craft into activism where it might not fit. And then that means that because I want anyone to get involved in craftivism, I always make sure all of our projects are accessible for anyone, whether you've done craft before or not. But the space within each project, if you are really good at craft, or you really love particular sewing techniques, or craft techniques, you can use that as embellishments in your craft. So I always, every project I do, I make it accessible, but it also gives you space to add in, you know, this craft skills and passions that you have. But it's always about using the craft to serve your cause. That's the main thing.
And what would you say that one needs to have to be a craftivist?
I think to be I mean, just talking about Craftivist Collective and gentle protest craftivism, what I always tell everyone that they need is compassion and consideration. So you need, I love the phrase by Martin Luther King Jr. He says that every activist should have a tough mind and a tender heart. So you need to be strategic in your head of, okay, what's the problem? What's the solution to that problem? Who are the decision makers involved? What influence do I have? What influence do others have? What's a tangible ask for those power holders that's realistic and time bound, that we can hold them accountable to? So all that strategy that we need really sharp minds for, that we can learn and hone that strategy. But then we need a tender heart, which is where the gentleness comes in. So we need to be compassionate. We need to put ourselves in the shoes of those directly affected by injustice. So in this case, you know, garment workers, cotton farmers, you know, how do they feel? How can we be in solidarity with them in a way that's dignified for them? But also, how do we put ourselves in the shoes of power holders? So if I'm the CEO of a fashion brand, or if I'm a shareholder or a trustee or a customer, how can I be part of the solution, and how can I be gently protested to encourage me to be part of the solution and not demonize me, not judge me, not cause more of a war than a discussion? So you need that tough mind and tender heart to be an effective craftivist, is what I think.
Good. Nice. Let's go to talk about the activities you do in your Craftivist Collective. And as long as we are in this Fashion Revolution Week, and we are not going to be able to go through all of them, they are available in your website, but yeah, I would like to go a little bit further on the mini fashion statements. If you can tell us what is the activity, what do you do, and
yeah. So I created these mini fashion statements, and it was, I think it was like 2 years after Fashion Revolution existed, after the Rana Plaza disaster. And I knew Ursula de Castro and Carrie Summers a little bit anyway. And I was following Fashion Revolution. And what I love about Fashion Revolution is it's very positive. It's not divisive. It's not naming and shaming brands. It's questioning and being curious and asking, who made my clothes? So you're holding them accountable, but in a question, not in a statement that's shouting at people. So I always supported it, but I noticed that there was a lot that you could do online with the hashtag, but there wasn't a lot you could do offline. And one of the privileges I have of running the Craftivist Collective is I get asked by a lot of museums and galleries and spaces to create drop-in craftivism workshops for people. And a lot of our craftivism can take hours, so it doesn't quite work. And with that in mind, with my love of Fashion Revolution, with the demands I was having to do drop-in sessions, I kept thinking, how can I complement what Fashion Revolution are doing, and how can I add to what they're doing? So I was thinking about, how do we reach people who might not already know of Fashion Revolution, or who might love fashion and not want to hear about the ugly side of the industry or feel named and shamed. So I came up with this idea of mini fashion statements. So you can see some little ones here that I made earlier. And in my head, my strategy was, if I found one of these in a pocket, so if I went to a shop that was a fast fashion store that wasn't very environmentally friendly, wasn't very good on their ethics, and I was trying on the clothes and I found this little scroll in the pocket, how can I encourage people to think about that side of the ugly side of the fashion industry? So you can see on this scroll, they're all in purple, turquoise or mauve. So in my book, I talk about how you can use different colors. So luxury colors are really good. And it says on the scroll, if you can see, it says, please open me, with a smiley face and a kiss, all lowercase, so it's intriguing people. And then the person who finds it, whether they tell anyone or not, they just quietly open up their little scroll. And the psychology behind it is, if you decide to read something, you're more likely to engage with an open heart and an open mind than if you're screamed at something or forced a big placard in front of you. So as the person who's found it, you've already decided to open it. And then when you open it to read it, it has one of three messages. As you can see on here, they're quite small. And this one says, if clothes could talk, ... what tales might they tell? Stories of how they were made with love, joy and care, or sadness, tragedy and heartbreak? What is the story behind this item of clothing? ? And then at the bottom, it says, join fashion revolution, with again, a smiley face. So it's about reaching people where they're at, who might not know a fashion revolution, who might not be thinking about ethical fashion. And you're gently nudging them to think about what's the story behind this item of clothes. And then they find out more by looking at the @FashRev, which it says at the bottom. So you're offering them a journey they can be part of to find out more of how they can be part of the solution, rather than just saying, here's something awful that's happened, and then you're not giving people ways to be part of the solution. And for the maker, what's great is it can take a few minutes to make your little fashion statement, and we encourage people to make a few, not too many that it's littering and using too many resources. But you write it in your neatest handwriting. You're not going to write something you don't agree with. So for the craftivist, you're more likely to reflect on what you're writing, to think, do I agree with this or not? So it shows that commitment you have. You know, tie it up in a really cute bow so you feel empowered to do something. And then you shop drop, which is the opposite of shoplifting. So you put them in clothes in shops that you think could be more ethical. And it's a great way for people to share online as well. So all of my projects have different objectives, but this one was about how do we reach people as a catalyst for conversation and thought where they're at without them feeling pushed into something? How do we encourage craftivists to make something to think about how they can be part of the solution as well? And then I created high resolution images and a positive press release for the fashion industry, from vloggers to bloggers to online influencers, to say, we love fashion, you love fashion, let's be part of making all sides of the industry beautiful. And the press release was really positive, really encouraging. So it was something that they could share with their readers and their followers without them feeling labeled or negative, but hopefully empowering people. So there's lots of angles to each project to really try and make the most of using these physical resources, which everyone watching this is, you know, so sensitive, rightly, about how we need to make sure that every physical resource we use sensitively, so we don't add more to landfill.
Okay, and how was the response of the people?
Yeah, so all different responses. So when we do the workshop, it's brilliant because people sometimes stay for a few minutes, but they can also stay for hours. You have people we've had 3 generations before, so parents, children and grandparents taking part, and it creates a real sense of solidarity that people are physically doing something that's important. Because it's anonymous, so you don't know who finds it in their pockets unless they know of the Craftivist Collective. because it's anonymous, I don't know the direct impact it's had with people, but in terms of media, we had it covered on the BBC News website on the homepage, which is one of the biggest and most popular websites in the world. So that was a real win. And we've also had it in fashion magazines and in different fashion outlets. And what's really interesting is hearing from fashion journalists who emailed me directly and thanked me for a really positive press release that doesn't name and shame brands. So it meant that a lot of them could share the project on their site or in their magazine without the risk of them losing brand advertisement, which was one of the things that I thought about in the press release as well. So always putting myself in the shoes of the industry themselves. So it's had influence in lots of different areas, and it's a timeless project so that it can be kept used. It's used every year during Fashion Revolution Week, but also different times of the year as well.
Nice, nice. So let's go to another project. Don't Blow It Hanky. You show really well all the methodology in the book, and I find it amazing. Can you tell us, a little what is about?
Yeah, so all of our projects are different, and this one came about when because my background's working in charity, so I used to work for Oxfam and the Department for International Development in the UK, and I still work a lot with charities, and I'm definitely an activist geek more than a craft lover, but I love how craft can be helpful in activism. So I had the CEO of a charity called Share Action, who do incredible shareholder activism. And she contacted me because she'd read my little book of Craftivism that you mentioned. And she said that for 3 years, Share Action with the Living Wage Foundation had tried to get one meeting with the CEO of Marks and Spencer's, which is one of the biggest retailers in the UK and is seen as a real national treasure in Britain. People have a real affinity to it for growing up with this brand. And for 3 years, they'd done stuff like big protests, they'd done lots of petition cards, they'd gone to their AGM and stood outside, they tried lots of traditional activism, more extrovert activism, to try and get this meeting, and they got nowhere. So the CEO of Share Action said they tried everything, nothing was working. The AGM was in 5 weeks. Could I do something that might work? So with my activist hat on, I thought, okay, so if the CEO isn't listening of the company, and the campaign was for them to become a living wage employer, they just wanted one meeting to discuss whether they could pay the living wage, which they weren't. They were paying the minimum wage, which they have to legally. So I thought, if the CEO isn't listening, who's above the CEO? It's the board members. The CEO is one of 14 board members. How do we engage them in a way that is more gentle, but is also holding them account? I'd already done the Don't Blow It Hanky project, where we'd made handkerchiefs for politicians to say, don't blow it, use your power for good. We know you've got a difficult job, but an important job. And it was a great way to build a relationship with your local politician. So I used that idea and tweaked it rather than create a new idea for the sake of it. I thought, okay, I'll buy handkerchiefs from Marks and Spencer's. I'll find 14 craftivists from across the UK who fit their core customer base, because I know that they'll listen to their core customers more than other people that don't look like their core customers. And I got each craftivist to look at everything about their board member. So Google them, go on LinkedIn, see what their CV is, how did they become a board member, what makes them tick, what are they passionate about, where are they a trustee for a charity, or really figure out what makes them tick as a person, and then make a handkerchief for them with a timeless quote on about being part of the positive change you want to see in the world, and a quote from someone that board member admires. So it could be someone dead, could be someone alive, and to really look at what colours they wear, incorporate that into your handkerchief, what words they use, whether they're really flamboyant or whether they're really shy. And I got them to make these bespoke handkerchiefs that was really about the board member as a whole person, not just as this role that they're in. And then we wrote handwritten letters to go along with the handkerchiefs that was all about the living wage. So we put on these handwritten letters how not only does it make sense in terms of dignity for their staff to be paid a living wage, but it also makes business sense in terms of productivity, in terms of staff retention, in terms of PR, having good PR. We said that how other companies their size had already paid the living wage and it was working well for them. So we had a really robust argument of why the living wage made sense and was realistic for them to implement. And then we went to the AGM as shareholders. We bought 1 share each to go to the AGM with a little box with each of our handkerchiefs in a ribbon with our handwritten letter. And we said, could we give you our gifts at the end of the big talk? Which they said that we could, because they were quite intrigued by it. We were very humble and shy and smiling about it rather than quite aggressive. And we hand delivered each of our handkerchiefs. So none of them saw what each of their handkerchiefs looked like, but they knew that we wanted a discussion about the living wage. And a few weeks later, the CEO said that he would have a meeting with us, with their head of HR. And for the next 10 months, we had lots of meetings that didn't involve any craft, but we're going back and forth about why they weren't still not paying the living wage, how we could help them do it. We handmade Christmas cards to say, all we want for Christmas is the living wage. Then we made Valentine's Day cards saying, show your love on Valentine's Day and pay the living wage. And just before the next AGM, the following year, they announced they were paying the living wage to 50,000 staff. So we went to the AGM to thank them, to say, well done you, not well done us, but we want you to become accredited living wage employers as well. And what was interesting is, from them being very standoffish and for being quite nervous about activists, they then came to us at the AGM to say, thank you for my handkerchief. One of the board members said that they went home and their children said, what's the living wage? Because they'd shown the gift. So they had that conversation. And the chair of the board took me aside at the second AGM and said it was the most powerful campaign they'd ever experienced, because it was so unusual, because it was handmade, it was small, it was humble, it wasn't on social media to say we're doing this. It was very intimate, it was very humble, it was about them. And every time they met, and the board meets regularly, so this is good for your viewers to remember about shareholder activism, the board meets regularly. And when they did, they kept saying to each other, what was on your handkerchief? Where did you put your handkerchief? Is it at home? Is it in the office? And then they'd say, well, you know, they have a point. They had quite a good argument about the living wage. Maybe we should look into it. So all of those elements of spending hours making a bespoke gift for them. So like this type of handkerchief you'll see, which, you know, can take hours to do, and you can see it's handmade. Using the senses in that way, making sure the language was positive and non-violent, and having the robust campaign, and then nudging them with handmade cards. The whole strategy helped it lead to that result of 50,000 people gaining a pay rise. And that's, you know, again, thinking about all of the elements, what colours you use, what fonts you use, who are you engaging, you know, it can make a real difference to do this gentle protest form of activism.
Wow, so inspiring, no? I think like with this kind of achievements, you see that it's possible to make a change. Like
it is. I mean, it's never a guarantee, and that's always the sad thing with any activism. You could have a perfect recipe and it work in one place and not the other. And it works in different ways. So some of the board who received their handkerchief didn't care at all, were not interested. This year we've been making green hearts to send to our politicians with their constituency name written on it. And some politicians are saying, this is amazing, I really care about climate change, so I'm going to wear it to show my commitment. And it helps them actually progress on climate change issues locally and nationally. For others, they'll put it in the bin and not reply to the Craftivist. So you never quite know, but I think you know, we have to still try, and we have to be strategic. We have to have that tough mind and tender heart. And sometimes you'll never know the impact. Sometimes a power holder will say it's had no impact on them, and it might have had a huge amount of impact on them. For others, they might say, oh yes, I completely agree with you, and secretly they don't agree with you. You never know, but I think as long as you've tried and you've threaded that compassion through your craftivism, then it'll make a difference in you. It might make a difference in other people who might see it online, in press releases, they might see it on social media. It's still worth doing, knowing that you can't fully control the output. And sometimes you just have to let go and see what type of ripple effects it has.
I find it really interesting that something that you say sometimes, like, you have to know which kind of activism to use when, no? And to whom, and
yeah. And I always say craftivism isn't to replace other forms of activism, it's to add to your activism toolkit. So I still do a lot of petition signing, lots of boring meetings with power holders. Some companies I'll boycott, others I'll buy shares in to campaign as a customer. So it's, you know, we need to see it as one tool in the activism toolkit. And that's what I love about Fashion Revolution. You know, you go on the website and there's so many different ways that you can be part of the solution at different times, at different, you know, with different amounts of, you know, long term and short term. We need to see it as holistically how we can all be that change we want to see in different ways.
Thank you. I wanted to just make a little point on this project, Stitchable Changemakers, because I find that you really take care on all the parts of the process, and I find it really interesting and really consequent on with what you're doing. Like, it's not only that you're stitching the faces of some people, but also the object itself is very important. So if you can tell us something more.
Yeah, and what's great about that is, you know, going through these 3 projects, they're all so different. So with the mini fashion statement scrolls, that's about doing stuff in the public sphere, and sometimes you might not know the impact and it's more of a nudge. With the handkerchiefs, it's very much about building a relationship with a power holder and holding them account, and it might be for a month, a year, or much longer. With our stitchable change makers, we have 4 very different ones. Yeah. So Desmond Tutu with a lovely quote. And that's much more about, again, seeing activism as lots of tools in the toolkit, as well as telling other people what to do. We really need to be thinking about what are we doing as well, and what are we practicing. You know, if we're telling some people to buy ethically, but we're wearing big brands of very unethical brands, then that's going to discredit what we do. We need to practice what we preach. So the stitchable change makers are there to encourage people about how we can be an effective change maker. So learning from change makers of the past. So we've got Desmond Tutu, we've got Abraham Lincoln, Eleanor Roosevelt, and Malala. And they're all very different change makers with different contexts, different genders, different power in different ways. So Malala had, you know, was shot in the head for going to school. So she used that awful experience to then say, this happened to me, I don't want it to happen to anyone else. But Eleanor Roosevelt happened to be the wife of a president. So her power came in directly through her husband. And then she said, well, I've got all this possible power and this spotlight, I'm going to use it for good in different ways. So you have very different change makers, and it's not saying that you should try and be them, because we can never be those people. It's saying, what power do I have? And how can I use that to make positive change? And they're dot to dots. As you can see, they start here and then they'll end up like this. And all of my projects, I have craft a thought questions. So every project, while you're hand stitching or while you're doing the paper craft, it gives you time to think through possibly uncomfortable questions while you have the comfort of craft. So with the stitchable change makers, we're saying to people, what can you learn from this change maker about courage, about compassion, about positive action, about real change that they've made? and what can you use with your own gifts and talents and power and context that you have? How can you be a change maker in your own way? And then you keep it as a physical reminder to be part of that change. So to be intentional about what you buy, how you treat people, how you are in the world as a consumer, as a citizen, as a colleague, as a family member, all of that stuff. How can we be the best global citizens we can be? And because you've made it, you can see the messy back, because you've made it, every time you see it, whether it's on your desk or on your mirror in the bathroom when you're brushing your teeth, it reminds you of those thoughts and feelings you had while you were stitching it. And it just encourages you to not be on autopilot, but to try and live and act intentionally. So we have the protest for the public, we have the protest for power holders, but then we have these objects as a form of inner activism, as a sort of protest to ourselves to say, how can we be change makers? And these, like all of them, I'm thinking about the environmental impact. So these are all made in a letterpress collective in Bristol, who are very ethical, and they're all made from offcuts of paper. So the paper that's recycled, non-toxic, but also paper that would not naturally go in the bin that we can use the offcuts of. So it's always thinking about all of those elements.
Yeah, thank you. I think that with this project, as you said, we can see like different ways that different kinds of project. So there's more, we know, and we can go through your website that we will write down it. But I want to know how is like this moment for you in the pandemic. We can't forget that we are here now, and how affected to your work.
Yeah, I mean, I'm in East London at the moment. We're still on high lockdown. I'm in Hackney. So we have high rates, highly populated. So I am stuck in my little flat, but I get to make all my kits and send them around the world. It's interesting for me. I was traveling a lot, doing lots of talks and workshops, trying to keep my carbon emissions down, but also trying to have as much impact as I could. And obviously that didn't happen. I don't do online workshops, which shocks a lot of people, because my workshops, whether they're for 10 people or for 100 people, they involve all the senses. So we have tablecloths with lovely colours on, we have flowers on the table, we have grapes for people to share. I have lavender smell for when people come in to help people calm down if they're angry or sad or anxious, and then helps them do more of that critical thinking once they craft. So I decided not to do online workshops because I did a few with some vulnerable groups, and it was not helpful because on Zoom, everyone's there. For some people, I attract a lot of people who are anxious, introverted, overwhelmed easily, and doing online workshops with people just wasn't helping. But I do get to do talks like this where I'm talking to people in Spain from my flat in London. So it's helped in one way, helped me slow down and be more strategic and not just fly around and, be reactive. But it's also helped me see the power of meeting in person and the sensory element that you're not going to get online, and how that's still really important. So this year in the UK, we have COP26 in Glasgow in November. So it's the UN climate conference with world leaders around the world. Hopefully it will be in person, but it's interesting with my work that our climate craftivism projects that we'll be doing in the summer that everyone can get involved in. So do join in. I have to think about how can it work online as well as offline. How can it work where we do stitch-ins, which are like small picnics for 12 people or less in a physical space where they're stitching outside a shop or outside an embassy or somewhere related to the campaign. I have to be thinking about how can we do that with small numbers, with masks potentially. All of that is just added to it. But if anything, it's reminded me that craftivism still really powerful online, with people sharing their craft of thought, sharing their progress. If you look at our social media accounts, they're still really helpful for people to have those conversations and be part of the solutions. But it can never replace that physical intimacy that you have with someone. You know, we get people to post their gifts to power holders, which is really powerful, but sometimes it can add even more power to physically hand it over and have a conversation with them. So it hasn't diluted the impact, but it's definitely made me aware of the importance of offline work and sensory work just as much as online.
Let's cross all our fingers so it can be soon, because I find that it's really necessary, that we really need this kind of project, these kind of meetings, and go back to...
Yeah, and I mean, I do these workshops all over the world where it's amazing how, I remember when I was in Stockholm and there was a person who worked for the embassy, so working in diplomacy, she was sitting next to someone who was an anarchist. And because we were in this space with instrumental music, with lavender smells, with scissors to share, with food and drink, it was a very safe space to ask each other these crafty thought questions that we offer for discussion. And because you're making something, you don't have to give eye contact while you're making something to listen to people. So and they had such a good conversation about, you know, I remember listening to one of them saying, so why are you an anarchist? And the other one saying, so what's the point of an embassy? And it created a safe space where they listened to each other much more than if one was in the embassy and the other one had a megaphone. We still need that for media attention and for messaging to get out there, but we also need these intimate, quiet spaces for contemplation, for conversation with people that you might disagree with or you might not come across. We need all of that. So you know, anyone listening, you don't have to wait till the pandemic ends. You know, you can take part in our craftivism in your bedroom and not tell anyone, or you can do it in your household and share every step on social media to join in. There's lots of different ways you can use craft in activism, but they're all valid and they're all useful at different parts of your campaign strategy.
Wow, great. Thank you very much, Sarah. I think it has been so inspiring, at least for me, but for the audience too. I'm sorry we need to finish, but let's finish up there. Sorry?
I feel like we could talk for hours about all of the different things to do.
Of course, yeah. Let's finish with a message you send, call to action, or yeah?
Yeah, I think my message to everyone is to start from what power do you have and what's the goal that you want for the fashion industry. So what's that goal you want for the industry to be this beautiful, kind and just place for everyone? And then what power do you have that you can be part of that change, but do it in a sustainable way for you so you don't burn out. Do it in a way that is about intimacy with people. It's not just doing lots of stuff all the time and big and brash, but really engaging people on that gentle, intimate way. And also challenge yourself on the amount of resources you use. So I'm very aware that I use physical resources. So I make sure they're as ethical as possible. We use as minimal amount of physical resources as possible to have maximum impact. So I'd think through all of those elements, and then you'll be much more confident and empowered to take action that's more likely to be effective as well.
Pues nada, muchas gracias, Sarah Corbett. Agradecer a la Casa Encendida el que nos proporcione estos espacios de reflexión, y nos vemos lunes, martes y miércoles en el taller o el jueves en el conversatorio, y tenéis toda la información en la web de la Casa Encendida. Chao.